back, AP! Alright, fantastic job yesterday in class. As you know, I noticed I'm wearing something different and I really need to shave. But, like, the big thing about it is, we talked about Machiavelli in class, right? Talked about his connection to Savonarola. If any of y'all didn't pick up on that, Savonarola drove out the Medici, right? And since Savonarola drove out the Medici, and then Savonarola ended up going to his own barbecue, and by that I mean burned at the stake and whatnot. Since that occurred, then a guy named Piero Soderini came in, and Machiavelli was working beneath Piero Soderini at the time as an assistant to the state, right? So, and in that time, he tried his best to do his job, but then, of course, the Medicis are going to ally with the King of Spain. They are going to come in, they're going to drive Soderini regime out and then reinstate themselves, and in that process, they arrest Machiavelli, they torture him. There's an announcement.
Your birthday was announced this morning. Please come to the office to get your birthday surprise. Thank you.
There's birthday surprises, apparently. So that's a big thing. Not the birthday surprise, but the fact that he then spent his time writing and things like that in banishment from Florence. And in that process, he writes his famous tome known as The Prince, right? And so in The Prince, he ends up, of course, theorizing these ideas of a perfect government, right? And funny enough, we left out a big part of the quote yesterday. He actually theorizes, and jot this down, according to Machiavelli, a ruler should be both feared and loved. But if you can't be both, you should just be feared. All right? So, his ideas, of course, is much more along the lines of, of course, he's going to be super sexist at the time because he's a Renaissance humanist, but he argues that women do not have the ability to lead much like men, and also arguments that governments are not judged by God, but they are actually judged by their people, right? And so since you are judging your government, it's all about its ability to provide stability and a worthwhile life, right? And so the idea is not necessarily you fear your leader, you live in fear, like we talked about yesterday. I think it was either Dakota Como or possibly Rufino that actually made that connection, being like, so fear is a relative term. We're not living in fear, but we fear what our leader is capable of, right? Like my dad, right? I fear what my dad is capable of because I saw what his interaction with my brother, right? Now, judged by their ability to provide stability, the government should actually be more feared in the sense of you've seen your leader do things to other people in other countries to protect you, to bring wealth to your country and prosperity to your country. You just don't want to cross him, right? But you love the stability he's providing, okay? So Machiavellian, though, eventually, like I said, is going to get twisted. That guy you're going to meet in the coffee shop later on in college is like, this is so Machiavellian. I give you full permission to slap that person in the face. He's probably going to be smoking a cigarette, so you can just flick that out first and pow! Because Machiavellian has now become a term for cunning and ruthlessness, even though that's not what it means, right? Machiavellian actually is supposed to be more pragmatic, right? How are you going to use your intensity to solve problems for your people, right? And Machiavellian basically then also began to go on and review other leaders, right? He wrote many, many essays on their effectiveness and the effectiveness of other leadership styles. And like I said, he was a massive fan of this guy named Caesar Borgia. Now, anyway, the humanist tradition, though, is then going to grow and continue to affect one other phylum of everything, right? And the humanist tradition began to demand reform from, guess who? The church. That's right. The seeds of the Reformation, Grace Cortez, were laid in the Renaissance, right? They will take some time to germinate, but they actually cross over perfectly. If we're looking at the grand scheme of things, you could argue that the Renaissance started at about mid-1300s, right? You could make this argument. Dante writes his works. Petrarch writes his works, also in the 1300s going into the early 1400s. You've got, I just handed Abigail Winningham a book yesterday about Brunelleschi's Dome, right? It's actually by Ross King, the same guy who wrote the, same guy who wrote the Pope and Michelangelo and the Pope's ceiling, right? So the big thing about all that is you have to understand is that was built in the late 1300s and it wasn't even finished until the 1400s. So, this idea that it doesn't start until 1450 is ridiculous. However, the Reformation truly begins right around 1517, right? So, knowing that these two things are existing at the same time is very important. The Renaissance started earlier, but when it hits high Renaissance, boom, the Reformation then comes flying at it, okay? So, the humanist tradition, though, going into the Christian phylum is going to happen. Humanists are going to begin to criticize popes, to look at the way things are structured, to be like, are we sure that this is a great idea? Like, that's going to literally be a natural human inquisitiveness. And many people, many religion teachers, and many theologians would argue that humanists are closer to their faith because they have the ability to question it, right? So you should always question things. You should always question things as they are given to you, not for being like perfectly true, right? Like, well, not necessarily perfectly true in terms of Christianity, but more along the lines of you should question things. You should question things because it gives you a deeper understanding. And that's what a lot of these Christian humanists were doing. So one of the biggest ones is a man by the name of Sir Thomas More, who is a very important dude who's also going to end up losing his noggin at one point. We should talk about that a little bit later on. But the big thing about it is Sir Thomas More, very famous figure because he was literally one of King Henry VIII's advisors, right? Henry VIII also living amongst the era of the Renaissance. That's right. This guy with his 6 wives started ruling England in 1509, right? To give you some perspective, knowing the date of Michelangelo's work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling will completely tether in all of this stuff, right? You know that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling from 1508 to 1512. You learn that over the summer in that text. Knowing those 4 years will give you so much better understanding of the stuff going on around it and its interconnectedness to that event, right? 1508 to 1512, that means while he was sitting there craning his neck back and getting stuff dripped in his eyes, Henry VIII was ruling England. Henry VIII is often considered a Reformation figure, but he's also around during the Renaissance. So you need to know that the Reformation and the Renaissance actually overlap each other. You gotta know that. You have to know that, all right? So, but anyway, Sir Thomas More was one of his advisors. Sir Thomas More, a devout Catholic, a very devout Catholic, wrote a famous text in 1516 called the Utopia. Now, 1516, a very important year because it comes 1 year before 1517, which is when Martin Luther is going to nail the 95 Theses to the door of that church, right? Let's double check on that date really quick. 95 Theses nailed to church. Even though he actually didn't do it, it's much more likely that he didn't actually do that. It's much more likely that it was a letter sent to a bishop. But I'm just saying, you should know. All right, so yeah, October 31st, Halloween in 1517 is when he actually, like, the Reformation is, like, beginning, right? So he writes this book called the Utopia. Now, you already probably know what the word utopia means, and you want to know why you know what the word utopia means? This perfect society, the thing that we all want. You also, a bunch of y'all have probably read or imbibed media that espouses dystopian universes as being non-utopian places like the Hunger Games or other things like that. All relates back to this word utopia. Utopia is a word coined by Thomas More when he titled his book The Utopia. He is the one that made that word prevalent, right? And the utopian idea just kept spreading, right? But according to his book, he claims that society has gone astray, right? He says that society has gotten really, really messed up. It is now all about the growth of money and power, and it has corrupted the human soul, and it has destroyed the human race because it has led us all to sin, right? And so his premise is the idea that utopia is an island, right? It is an island nation that is cut off terrestrially from other places so it does not have border wars or disputes, right? And in the premise of the book, he's talking to this guy named Raphael, who's another priest as well. And they're basically arguing back and forth on what would create the perfect society, right? And so their argument comes down to the fact that it takes place on this island. Children are to receive a fantastic education, and all children receive an equal education. Now, that is a very important part of this, right? Because it's going to start to smell a little bit like something here in a second, okay? So, continuing to go forward with this, though, you got to understand that he's saying every child receives the same education that is actually structured by the leadership of this island, right? Adults are to spend their days laboring in the fields, right? And they all work together for the same goal of advancing society. People do not work in certain jobs that put them above other people, right? They work in the same or similar jobs, right? Also, the idea of that they, after laboring, they then go to their homes and they sit and they read Greek literature, which who would have thought that one was coming? I don't know, probably not me, but that's a Renaissance element, right? This idea that, oh, we're going to read Greek literature for a while so we can understand the ancients a little bit better, right? So we can begin to continue to educate ourselves. Poverty, the idea of poverty is fixed Because they have devalued things like gold and silver, which are not precious metals or commodities anymore. They're actually just useless things that you can make other products out of, okay? Private property is also exterminated, right? No one is allowed to have private property. Everything is shared. And also, apparently, there are no disagreements ever. What does this sound an awful lot like? Exactly, yeah. It sounds a lot like communism, right? It almost sounds exactly like Marx's ideas are just being replicated. Now, you got to understand, though, the biggest difference between Marx's ideas and this one is that Marx believes that religion should be null and void, whereas Sir Thomas More believes that it's still very important. For example, I believe it was Lenin that said religion is the opiate of the masses, or Marx. It's one of the two of them. But basically, like, communists in the modern 20th century were atheistic, whereas Sir Thomas More was not, and all of this was actually based on Christian theology, right? So the idea, though, is that people are punished too harshly, and all of the society's problems come because they have different jobs, they have different wealth, they have more of this money, or whatever you want to call it, silver and gold. What makes it any better than a piece of nickel from the ground is what Sir Thomas More is arguing. And by eliminating this impetus to steal or to do more or to try and take from another person, make everyone equal, make everyone not own private property, and then that way there'll be no disagreements ever, right? And so his book was written as a criticism. It criticizes the death penalty explicitly. It really goes hard on the idea of killing another person because of their crimes. According to Sir Thomas More, much like any other thing of murder, you have to understand that killing someone because they committed a crime against the state is still to him considered murder and a spite against God, right? So he believes that the death penalty should be done away with. He also, when he's having this discussion with this guy named Raphael in the book, who's like a character in the book, you have to understand, he's arguing that the criminal has learned nothing. It is not preventing people from committing crimes. They will continue to commit crimes as long as someone has more of this gold or silver or money than they do, right? So, also it criticizes the enclosure system, okay? Now, something that's really important is this is going to be like a stick in Henry VIII's craw because he does not like that, because he actually likes the enclosure system because it made more money for the nobles, right? We'll talk about what the enclosure system is, but do me a favor, highlight the word enclosure system in your notes, underline it, circle it, make it look like it's exploding, because we will come back to that word multiple times. The enclosure system is a very, very important kind of like fulcrum in the lever of European history, because it's going to lead to a lot of different things, right? Much like Louisiana was the fulcrum of the French Empire for a while, and it actually was supposed to lead them into northern America, and then also keep their like sugar colonies going for France. The enclosure system is a very big deal when you're talking about stop being so agricultural, now we're industrial, stuff like that. Now, utopia is painted as this perfect place, though, right? Where there are no locked doors, and all wealth is redistributed, and everyone is working together, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. However, you have to understand that it's a very creepy kind of utopia, because basically Sir Thomas More is arguing in a sense that when you swear your allegiance to a Catholic community, you take on a vow of poverty, right? That's a big thing. It's in the Benedictine rules. We'll discuss that a little bit later on when we get to the Reformation, even though ironically that one wasn't added until the 1300s. But you take this vow of poverty, and you take this vow of like obedience, and you take this vow of community, and so, you shouldn't worry about the fact that, if you break rules, instead of killing you, we're going to enslave you? Yeah, so according to Sir Thomas More Utopia, people will still commit crimes, right? That is something that is just going to happen. Well, according to Sir Thomas More, when you commit crimes, you are enslaved by the government, right? So the government of Utopia, the government of this fictional island, makes you a slave, and you are bound together by golden chains, because gold is now worthless because it's the same stuff used to chain slaves together and also to make chamber pots, right? So the big thing about it is slavery in this book is like a constant threat. So it's like this creepy, murky thing in the background, right? There is no perfect society, basically, is what we're getting at, is when you look at this as a criticism, you have to understand, like, people aren't even allowed to make their own choices. They have to go out and labor in the fields. They then have to go home and they have to, like read Greek literature. They have to make sure they're sending their kids and stuff. If you have premarital sex, you're punished with celibacy. You have to take a vow of celibacy for the rest of your life, and you're not allowed to do that for the rest of your life. According to Sir Thomas More's Utopia, adultery was punished with enslavement. If you cheat on your spouse, you're enslaved to another family for the rest of your life. This one's interesting. Euthanasia was permissible. If you thought that like you wanted to die, then that was fine, but like the government's not allowed to kill you, which I just find to be like kind of like a funny little contradiction, right? So now, really, really quick, religious tolerance, though, surprisingly accepted. So that's really, really interesting. You see Thomas More going down this route of like, don't do this and don't do that and follow Catholic rules or you'll be enslaved. But you like pagans, knock yourself out. So it's very, very interesting in that sense, right? And to continue to go forward, on top of everything, you could be enslaved for minor crimes in a utopia. If you were caught not working or laboring in the fields, you could be enslaved for a period of time, right? Like, if you were caught doing this or not doing that. So, Sir Thomas More's utopia, the reason why it's Christian humanism, some of you are like, this sounds a lot like civic humanism. The reason why it's Christian humanism is because, as you can tell, all the rules of their society are backed up by Catholic ideals, right? Adultery is a sin, therefore you're enslaved. Poverty is, or like excess or gluttony, of course, of any type is a sin. That's why you're punished with enslavement if you do not work and stay within our ubiquitous class of sharing, right? Like poverty is a vow you took, so like going away from that is a sin. So like this idea is basically creating a perfect religious community, right? Something backed up by religious ideals. So Sir Thomas More is a very, very important figure, and we will come back to him, but he's one of Henry VIII's chief advisors. But there is no other guy when it comes to Christian humanism like this dude, Desiderius Erasmus. And for those of you who truly read that book, if you truly read Ross King's Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, you remember this name, right? Desiderius Erasmus was one of the original critics of the church, right? Desiderius Erasmus in 1520 is a Dutch, well, he's Flemish, but like Dutch basically in a sense, thinker. And his first name, Desiderius, is his first name. Desidirus. Desiderius, right? So Erasmus believed a lot of things that really shook the bedrock of, of Christianity in general, right? He actually popped up in like 1520 more than anything else after Martin Luther's Reformation had began, but he had started his career way earlier than that. So you know what? Just kind of scribble that or delete that year out of there. It's not that important, because the big thing that's important of him is like some of his texts and some of the things that he wrote, and mostly the things that he said, right? So the big thing about Erasmus is he was very, very critical of a lot of different ideas, right? He was the guy that kind of inspired Martin Luther to start being more critical of the church and stuff like that. He advocated for childlike views of Christianity. He said that we should not be living our lives like trying to have a checklist into heaven. We should have an open faith with the Lord, and then we should be communal, and then we should just try to live our best life, right? There should not be rules and regulations that are saying you are going to get into heaven faster than they are going to get into heaven. And so he advocated for this concept. He wanted all biblical text also to be translated into vernacular languages. He said the fact that priests are the only people that can read the Bible is disgusting. The fact that they are the only ones that know how to read Latin, how are we supposed to teach children how to read if they can't read the book that is only commonly copied at this time? Translate these things into different languages. And he actually defied the church when he did it first, when he translated it into Greek, right? So he translated it into Greek so he could easily spread it amongst the humanist community, because many of them were learning how to read Greek so they could translate certain Greek works, right? So the big thing also is he believed that education leads to reform. Live like Christ. Don't checklist your life, right? And he espoused all these things in a book that he wrote, and you need to jot this book down, okay? This book was called The Praise of Folly, right? Praise of Folly, Folly. And in this book, he advocates for all these concepts, you know what I mean? But he also begins to poke fun at the church hierarchy, okay? So I don't know if you remember this from the book, but there was a point where there was an image in the book of Julius II standing out front of heaven with a list of his sins waiting to get in while other people were allowed to go, right? Basically saying that Julius II, the Pope at the time, was a bad person that did not deserve immediate entrance into heaven because he did not live a life the way he was supposed to. That's what he said. Erasmus is the guy that said that, and he wrote that, and he had that drawn up and put into a pamphlet-like form and distributed around. Erasmus criticized Julius II heavily for his things that he did, hoarding money for the church, spending it on things that he didn't need to spend money on, going and conquering other people. He's the first one that called Julius II the warrior pope, right? Fighting wars and having people killed in the name of growing your papal state boundaries, right? Erasmus, massive critic, super intense dude. Very, very important, all right? So, like, highlight him, star him, very important. Now, another big thing, though, that comes into play here is women's role in the Renaissance, right? Alberti, of course, that guy, Leon Battista Alberti, said that women's key skills were the following. And he is the Renaissance man. He's like the Renaissance man humanist. He can do all kinds of stuff, right? Alberti said that women should be good at serving meals, supervising servants, educating children, and why am I not surprised that he never got married? Now, ironically enough, Alberti was single for his entire life, and he never actually got married, and we wonder why, because he believes that women should only have roles that are sedentary and completely confined to a household, right? Now, anyway, he's an idiot. Now, anyway, he might be super smart, he might be a cryptographer and stuff like that, but he apparently does not have any people skills. So, the big thing, though, is that the Renaissance is going to leak to the female class anyway. Because making things that are vernacularly available for women to read, imbibe, and go forward with, it's going to occur, right? So some believed that education for women was actually very, very good, right? There were growing phylums of nuns that were growing up. They were like, wait, women should be able to read. And you know what? Alberti might be a tool, but he's not wrong about one thing. Women should be in charge of educating children. And because we're their mothers, and there's not schools or elementary schools for these children yet, right? There's not these higher order thinking places for the children yet. So I should be able to teach them how to read, and if they need to know how to read, I need to know how to read, and if I can read, I can also learn, right? So the idea that women in educational systems was a good thing really began to grow in the Renaissance and actually began to quietly stir the pot of women being able to have access to educational thought. Many thought that, like, some other Renaissance thinkers are like, oh, education for women is going to lead to have them having too much action. They're going to do too much. So there were two different ideas popping around. But this woman is considered one of the best examples of why you should educate women in the Renaissance. This is Isabella d'Este, known as the First Lady of the Renaissance, right? Her letters to friends and family showcased her ability as a highly educated and adept Renaissance woman, right? You have to understand that she defied the norms of the time. Isabella d'Este learned to read, read everything she could get her hands on, and became a part of this thing that was known as the Republic of Letters, right? So write down the Republic of Letters. And then I want you to write it down over there in the margins, though, like somewhere over here on the right side. And I want you to draw a letter or a thing on the Republic of Letters. We'll draw an arrow going up to Erasmus, and an arrow going to Este, and then an arrow going to Sir Thomas More. So many Renaissance humanists were a part of this thing known as the Republic of Letters, where they would write down their ideas and send them to people, and people would be like, okay, well, here's what I think about that idea, and send it off. Machiavelli was a part of his own Republic of Letters, and it wasn't a centralized thing. Like, you didn't send it to the Republic House and they sent it out to somebody else. It just went and bounced around, and so you had your ideas reviewed and, like, corrected and debated and things like that in the style that was the most appropriate, which was to, like, write to one another, right? And Isabella d'Este wrote so many letters to friends and family, and it showed her ability to critique things. She said how to do things correctly, where society was going wrong, and she had thoughts of her own. She was an independent, intense woman, right? And she was highly educated. She eventually even began to rule over a small area of Italy. A small kingdom fell under her command completely. She is one of the very first female leaders of Europe ever, because her husband went insane and then eventually died, and she actually ruled over the small area of Romagna in Italy by herself. She was like, what's up, what's up, what's up? And then she did a great job, and the people did not dethrone her because she was the first lady of the Renaissance, right? This woman, Isabella d'Este, is like the prototype for what Christine de Pizan advocated for. Now, this is really important, okay? Christine de Pizan would look at Isabella d'Este as one of the best examples of a Renaissance woman. Because Christine de Pizan had written about what a Renaissance woman should be. And she would hold up Isabella d'Este as being a great example of one. So she is the very first female vernacular writer. Christine de Pizan is actually also Italian, and she used her literary abilities to make money. She would review things for people. She would actually correct certain items. She would read and translate different things for people. But eventually, she became somebody that was very important in their community. And she then wrote a book known as the Book of the City Ladies. And what this did is it became the tome of why you should believe women should be educated, right? It wrote contrary to Alberti's opinion, saying, no, women should be educated because it is the great equalizer, right? If you give women an education, they will educate their children and they will have more to do and more to say in their society. And she could point to Isabella d'Este and be like, see, that's what I'm talking about right there. So do me a favor and highlight the Book of City Ladies, because this became a very widely read and a widely printed book during this time. You have to understand that all of this stuff hinges around the invention of one particular thing. Let's look at something really, really fast, and then we're going to wrap this whole thing up because this part doesn't take much time. Petrarch versus Erasmus. All right, so now look, talking about Christine de Pizan, Isabella d'Este, Desiderius Erasmus, Sir Thomas More in his book, things like that, The Prince, Machiavelli. We really don't even have to necessarily just put Erasmus right here. We could actually say Dante and Petrarch versus Erasmus, Machiavelli, Sir Thomas More, Christine de Pizan, etc. So your earliest humanist versus your later humanist. But let's look at these two guys just to make this example a little bit easier. Petrarch wrote his tome, The Ascension of Mount Venue. He wrote like several different works. And with his translations, though, Petrarch's stuff didn't travel very fast. His stuff came out in the 1350s and spread very slowly person to person, okay? So people would be able to walk up to somebody and be like, oh, well, I have this thing Petrarch wrote. Not specifically, but someone copied it for me. Notice what I said. They copied it for me. Legit, they copied it for me. And then you had to, every time you wanted to distribute another text, had to have it copied. Like, check this out. First work of the Divine Comedy. Look at this copy of the Divine Comedy. This legit is one of the earliest known texts of the Divine Comedy, right here, okay? It was created and actually made, we believe, in the late 1300s. This bad boy is completely handwritten, all right? So if you wanted to read the Divine Comedy, read the word of Petrarch, read the word of early humanists, you had to find someone who was willing to copy a book by hand. This is why there were so many copies of the Bible floating around, due to the fact, like, look at this one. This is another one, too. They also all had hand-drawn illustrations in them, little filigrees laid out on the outside. Books were considered works of art in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance because they were so expensive. Look at the map of hell right here in this early work of the Divine Comedy. You got to understand. That is why Dante's and Petrarch's ideas did not catch fire and spread super quickly until the later 1400s, because you had to have an excessive amount of money to be able to access them. This is a piece of art. It took a long time to make. There were so many copies of the Bible because monks used to take vows of silence, and in those vows of silence, they would just sit there and copy Bibles to other Bibles, right? Like, so they would just be like, oh, I'm on John again, blah, 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 blah. And they would just do that for expansive times on end. But Petrarch and Dante didn't have access to a tool that Erasmus and many others did. And that tool is known as the printing press, right? I know right now Angelina Murphy is just freaking out right now because she loves the concept of this thing because it makes everything make so much sense. The printing press is probably the most important invention to come out of the late Renaissance period, or excuse me, the high Renaissance period than any other one, right? The printing press, or Gutenberg's press, is going to be created by a metalsmith and goldsmith by the name of Johannes Gutenberg. Funny enough, though, he stole the idea. Now, let's discuss this for a hot second. Remember when we talked about the Eastern Golden Age? We'll review that again a little bit in class. We talked about the Eastern Golden Age. We talked about how Southeast Asians, the Arabs, all these West or East Coast Africans were making a ton of money. The Islamic kingdoms were making a ton of money, and they were also spreading their ideas and stuff like that. Funny enough, with economic prosperity comes technological innovation. Technology like this had already existed for several hundred years, right? The Asians had actually made printing presses long before the European models came out. This right here is examples of some of their types. Now, we'll get to types here in a second, okay? But the thing about Johannes Gutenberg, okay, that's his name actually, Johannes Gutenberg, is he actually just differentiated his press a little bit differently, and he made it out of metal. The only downfall to the original Asian designs of printing presses was that all the types were made out of wood, right? And since they were made out of wood, they only had certain access to them because they had to all be hand carved, okay? So the way a type works, or what a type is, imagine a Scrabble tile, right? A Scrabble tile has one letter on it, okay? That is what you would call a type, okay? Just like why when you're on your keyboard, for those of you who are typing your notes, that's why it's called typing, because each of the letters are called types. You are typing it, right? That's why it's called a typewriter, because it slaps a metal S into a ribbon and presses the ink onto paper, right? So that is why it's called typing, or a type, all right? So when you do a press, you have to take all these types and run them together. If you want to make a sentence, if I want to say, Mr. Terry smells like cheese, I would have to take an M, put it there, an R, put it there, a period, put it there, a T, put it there, like, and I would have to line the entire thing up, including spaces, and then rub ink on it, and then press it down. The only hard part about it is if you make yours out of wood, like the original Asiatic models, the wood degrades. It rots. It soaks the ink up. It's not as proliferated. Whereas Gutenberg's metal press was designed to be the very first type, as in specific lettering, printing press, right? We just explained what types were. And it was made out of metal, so it didn't degrade nearly as fast, right? Now, ironically enough, though, Gutenberg's press only caught fire because of everything else that had been going on. Gutenberg got lucky, all right? So Gutenberg is considered to be one of the most prominent figures and one of the biggest people in all of European history because, oh, he made the printing press, brah, 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 which is debatable, right? And the reason why it's called a press, though, is because legit, after you laid all the types up and stuff, you would take these things that look like maracas and dip them in ink and go dip, 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 and then you would literally just go crank this thing down, and it would go smush. It was like a big stamp, and then you would pull that off, and you would do another page, and then pull that off and do another page, and do it all. Like, it's very, very simple. The interesting part about it is Gutenberg only got successful because paper making had become so much more efficient, right? So the Chinese and the Muslims in Spain had actually learned how to make paper faster, and they sold excessive amounts of it to the Europeans, right? So the big thing about it is literacy, because of this, exploded. So ironically enough, when you really, really look at it, Gutenberg, put a little star next to this, Gutenberg's not that important. Gutenberg's press is not that important. If somebody would have invented it anyway, had the Chinese and the Koreans not invented the first printing press, and had the Muslims not made a more efficient paper-making system. But because of this printing press and the printing revolution, as it's called, printing revolution, exclamation mark as it's called, literacy would explode. And the very first Gutenberg press, I believe, was designed in like 1448. But let me double check on that year real fast. Gutenberg press. Really, really quick, apparently was designed in there is no specific date, but we believe that it was somewhere close to the 1440s. Yeah, so the big thing about it, though, Gutenberg the man, not that important. The device he used was just a simple upgrade from the stuff that already existed, right? But the very first books would be printed on it. And what do you think the very first book printed on it was? The Bible, right? And the original one that was printed on there, it's called the Gutenberg Bible, and it literally still exists, right? Books are now made by books were now made by monks, nuns, and printers. Printers are going to proliferate books much faster. So Praise of Folly by Desiderius Erasmus got out there faster because the printing press was already around and he could print multiple copies, right? Martin Luther's 95 Theses gets printed like crazy because it's going to be easily made now. Also, jot this down, print shops become propaganda centers, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we actually get into class in the next class period. I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.